Why is America angry? Unpacking the US-India trade tension over Russian oil. In the complex theater of global geopolitics, few relationships are as strategically vital, and as paradoxically strained, as that between the United States and India. On the surface, the two democracies are natural allies, bound by shared values, converging security interests in the Indo-Pacific, and deepening economic ties. Yet beneath this amicable facade simmers a quiet but growing tension, one centered on India's continued and expanding purchase of Russian crude oil since Moscow's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. To many observers, particularly in India, America's irritation seems perplexing, even hypocritical. Why should Washington care if New Delhi buys discounted oil from Russia? After all, isn't energy security a sovereign right? Isn't India a friend, not a foe? To understand America's frustration, and why it matters, one must look beyond the simplistic lens of bilateral trade and delve into the architecture of global power, economic warfare, and the unspoken rules of alliance politics in the 21st century. The context: sanctions as economic warfare. When Russia invaded Ukraine, the United States and its Western allies responded not just with military aid to Kiev but with an unprecedented economic assault on Moscow. Sanctions targeted Russian banks, oligarchs, technology imports, and, crucially, its energy exports, the lifeblood of the Russian economy. The goal was clear: to cripple Russia's ability to fund its war machine by cutting off its revenue streams. The European Union, once heavily dependent on Russian gas and oil, undertook a painful but determined pivot away from Russian energy. Even nations with traditionally neutral or non-aligned foreign policies, such as Switzerland and Singapore, imposed restrictions. India, however, charted a different course. Prior to the war, India imported less than 2% of its oil from Russia. By mid-2023, that figure had ballooned to over 35%, making Russia India's single largest oil supplier. Indian refiners, both public and private, snapped up Urals and ESPO crude at steep discounts, sometimes $20 to $30 per barrel below global benchmarks. For a nation that imports over 85% of its oil needs and is acutely sensitive to fuel inflation, the economic logic was irresistible. Cheaper oil meant lower domestic fuel prices, reduced trade deficits, and a cushion against global inflationary pressures. But to Washington, India's oil spree was not merely a shrewd commercial decision, it was a geopolitical end run around the Western sanctions regime. The American perspective: undermining collective pressure. From the U.S. standpoint, the effectiveness of sanctions hinges on universality, or at least, broad compliance. When major economies like India, with its 1.4 billion consumers and growing global influence, continue to pour billions into Russian coffers, they dilute the intended economic pain. U.S. officials estimate that India's purchases have transferred over $40 billion to Russia since the invasion, money that, critics argue, may well be funding tanks, missiles, and drones deployed in Ukraine. Moreover, India's actions come at a time when the U.S. is actively courting it as a linchpin in its Indo-Pacific strategy to counterbalance China. The irony is not lost on American policymakers: while Washington arms India, shares intelligence, and elevates it in multilateral forums like the Quad, New Delhi is simultaneously propping up Moscow, a key strategic partner of Beijing. This creates a dissonance that undermines the coherence of U.S. foreign policy. American frustration is also rooted in perceived double standards. While Europe sacrificed short-term economic comfort for long-term strategic alignment, India, a fellow democracy and supposed partner of choice, appears to be free-riding on Western sacrifices while reaping commercial benefits. U.S. officials have stopped short of imposing secondary sanctions on India, as they have on some Chinese entities, but the diplomatic rebukes have grown sharper. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has publicly urged India to think twice about deepening energy ties with Russia. Congressional hearings have featured bipartisan criticism. Behind closed doors, American diplomats reportedly convey their disappointment with increasing urgency. India's defense, sovereignty, pragmatism, and historical ties. India's position, however, is neither capricious nor malicious. It rests on three pillars: energy security, non-alignment, and historical partnership. First, energy is not a luxury for India, it is an existential imperative. As the world's third-largest oil importer, India must secure affordable supplies to fuel its economic growth, maintain price stability, and avoid social unrest. With domestic production stagnant and alternative sources, like the Middle East, offering no comparable discounts, Russian oil is simply too good an opportunity to pass up. Indian officials argue that if the US truly wants to reduce global dependence on Russian oil, it should increase its own exports or pressure OPEC to lower prices, not punish nations making rational economic choices. Second, India has never subscribed to the Western notion of with us or against us. Its foreign policy is rooted in strategic autonomy, a legacy of the non-aligned movement and a reflection of its own civilizational confidence. India will not allow its energy decisions to be dictated by Washington, just as it refuses to be drawn into overt anti-China coalitions or to condemn Russia outright at the UN. This is not defiance for its own sake, it is a calibrated assertion of independence. Third, Russia remains a critical partner for India, not just in energy, but in defense. Over 60% of India's military hardware is of Russian origin, and despite diversification efforts, Moscow remains its most reliable arms supplier, especially in times of crisis, as during the 1971 war with Pakistan and the 1999 Kargil conflict. Cutting ties abruptly would jeopardize India's defense readiness, a risk New Delhi is unwilling to take, particularly with China massing troops along the Himalayan border. The unspoken subtext: hierarchy in alliances. Beneath the surface of this dispute lies a deeper, more uncomfortable truth: the US still operates within a framework where alliances imply hierarchy. Washington expects its major partners to fall in line on core geopolitical issues, especially those involving adversaries like Russia. India, however, refuses to be slotted into such a subordinate role. It seeks a relationship of equals, one where cooperation on shared interests, like maritime security or tech collaboration, does not require automatic alignment on every global flashpoint. This mismatch in expectations fuels American irritation. US policymakers struggle to reconcile India's strategic value with its transactional flexibility. They want India to be a responsible stakeholder in the liberal international order, but on American terms. India, meanwhile, insists on defining its own responsibilities, based on its national interest and civilizational ethos. The economic dimension, trade leverage and long-term risks. The oil issue also intersects with broader US-India trade tensions. American manufacturers have long complained about Indian tariffs, intellectual property practices, and market access barriers. India, in turn, resents US protectionism in agriculture and technology. The Russian oil purchases add fuel to this fire. Some in Washington see India's energy pragmatism as part of a larger pattern of free-riding, benefiting from US security guarantees and market access while refusing to shoulder commensurate burdens. There are long-term risks for India, too. Over-reliance on Russian oil, and payment mechanisms that skirt Western financial systems, could expose Indian banks and companies to future US sanctions or regulatory scrutiny. The rupee-ruble trade mechanism, while innovative, is cumbersome and limits scalability. Moreover, as Europe and the US accelerate their green transitions, India risks being seen as a laggard, or worse, a spoiler, in the global energy realignment. Toward a resolution. Pragmatism over principle. Despite the friction, neither side wants a rupture. The US needs India as a counterweight to China and a democratic anchor in Asia. India needs American technology, investment, and diplomatic support. Both recognize that the Russian oil issue, while symbolically charged, is ultimately manageable if handled with nuance. A quiet compromise may already be emerging. India has reportedly reduced its Russian oil purchases in recent months as prices have converged with global benchmarks. It has also increased imports from the US, which, while still a minor supplier, is growing in importance. Meanwhile, Washington has refrained from punitive measures, signaling a preference for quiet diplomacy over public confrontation. The path forward lies in reframing the issue, not as a test of loyalty, but as a negotiation between two sovereign powers with overlapping but not identical interests. The US must accept that India will not, and should not, sacrifice its economic imperatives on the altar of Western solidarity. India, in turn, must recognize that its actions have strategic consequences, and that true partnership requires some degree of burden sharing. Conclusion: the price of strategic autonomy. America's anger over India's Russian oil purchases is not really about oil. It is about expectations, hierarchy, and the unspoken contract of alliance. Washington wants India to behave like a traditional ally, coordinated, compliant, and predictable. New Delhi insists on behaving like a great power, independent, pragmatic, and self-interested. In a multipolar world, this tension is inevitable. The challenge for both nations is to manage it without letting it corrode the broader relationship. India's purchase of Russian oil is not an act of hostility, it is an assertion of sovereignty. America's irritation is not mere petulance, it is the frustration of a hegemon adjusting to a world where its influence, while still vast, is no longer absolute. The lesson? In the 21st century, even the closest partnerships will be tested by divergent interests. The strength of the US-India relationship will be measured not by the absence of conflict, but by the maturity with which both sides navigate it. Oil may be the spark, but the real issue is whether two giants can learn to dance without stepping on each other's toes.